The oil industry's losses and gains amidst the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has arguably affected every industry under the sun. Think about the manufacturing, tourism, travel, entertainment, healthcare, commerce, finance, government, real estate, telecommunication, and education sectors. It's only the degree of losses and gains that varies. Similarly, the oil industry has seen its worst in decades and centuries. Consider that oil prices fell to an unbelievable low of negative $40 per barrel. That's the lowest price ever recorded from the time the New York Exchange started trading oil futures in 1983. Read on below for more insight into the oil industry's losses and gains brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. Number 1, job losses. By the end of 2020, more than 100,000 Americans working in the oilfield service sector had lost their job, and the number even more alarming when you look at statistics from other top oil producers like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Canada, Iraq, China, and the United Arab Emirates. What happened is that the demand of oil fell sharply as governments across the world imposed mandatory travel restrictions to curb the spread of the contagious virus. With most non-essential services providers confined to their homes, there was no need to fuel cars. Likewise, the aviation industry, which is the second largest consumer of oil after road transportation, came to a grinding halt as most international flights were suspended. This resulted into heavy losses of oilfield services firms as well as oil and gas vendors. Some had to even file for bankruptcy. They had no option but to fire their employees in the thousands. Other employees also succumbed to the virus. However, when the number of coronavirus infections and deaths started decreasing, governments reopened their economies by easing travel restrictions. The demand for oil gradually started increasing as is said to continue the upward trend in the coming years. It therefore follows that oil producing firms have to fill the vacant positions for their many high paying jobs like drilling consultants, rig managers, petroleum engineers, geologists, well testers, and chemical engineers. You may want to try your luck by applying for such positions whenever they are advertised. You stand a chance to get employed since the oil industry has a dire need of workers to get production rolling once. Number 2, operational changes. Government across the world agree that oil and gas operations are essential services. Because of this, they were largely spared from lockdowns as the COVID-19 raged on. But even so, some workers got infected by the virus and had to stay away from work to protect their colleagues from infection. Other employees died as a result of coronavirus, leaving vacant positions. In addition to that, the implementation of social distancing rules greatly hampered production efforts. This meant that the oil firms had to grapple with shortage of workforce. You could argue that shortage of oil workers could be easily solved by shutting down oil rigs and sealing off the wells. However, such a move is accompanied by the risk of permanently losing their assets. And when they decide to resume the drilling, it would require humongous capital investment to bring back the abandoned rigs of operation. Thus, firms which took this route are likely to lose their competitive advantage over other competitors for quite a long time. Luckily, some of the more understanding governments saved oil drillers from such economic annihilation by offering to fund their expenses until demand picks up. That's obviously operating on a loss, but it's necessary given the prevailing circumstances. Number 3, the force majeure clause. This refers to unpredictable events that hinder an entity from fulfilling a contract. Oil drilling contractors usually sign contracts with oil companies and governments. Their mandate is to hire and supervise workers, plan projects, maintain site safety, and ensure that they meet production targets set by their clients. The COVID-19 pandemic made it practically impossible for such contractors to fulfill their contract requirements. As such, most of them invoked the force majeure provision to excuse their poor performance. While this seems a straightforward process, know that All contractors have such provisions, and for those contracts with these guidelines, there might still arise misunderstandings between a contractor and their clients regarding the circumstances that justify the use of the force majeure clause. Inconsiderate clients usually demand that contractual obligations must be fulfilled no matter the prevailing circumstances. The result is conflict between the different stakeholders as well as blame games, fault finding, and confusion. It's the hope of many that the pandemic will come to a stop so that the oil industry can be restored to a reasonable state. Number 4, increased calls for diversification. Some developing countries like Iran, Algeria, Libya, and Iraq are disproportionately commodity dependent. Oil and gas make up 60% of their export income. For this reason, their countries are extremely vulnerable to the volatility of oil prices. When oil prices plummet, their earnings decrease sharply and destabilize their economies. There have been calls for many years by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and other global trade experts for these countries to diversify their revenue streams to other sectors like tourism, agriculture, and manufactured goods. Though the call seems to have fallen to deaf ears at first, the coronavirus pandemic rejuvenated these campaigns. It's greatly hoped that these countries will learn from the pandemic and branch into other income-generating sectors. Number 5, campaign for clear energy. Climate campaigners say the coronavirus pandemic provided the perfect time for global leaders to restructure oil-related environmental policies. Since the oil industry faced losses amounting to billions of dollars, it's unlikely that the major players will soon get back on its feet. Investors are likely to are actually scared of putting more money into the oil industry. If they could only pump money into alternatives like wind and solar power, the carbon footprint on the environment will greatly reduce in the coming years. In conclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic brought both blessings and misfortunes to the oil industry. It's good to use the positive impact of the pandemic to your benefit, but then move on with caution so as not to fall into traps of misfortune should another pandemic strike.